Hey, everybody. Let's talk about the Troubadour poets and why we're reading or thinking about these poets from centuries and centuries ago. There's a writer who I've never heard of before who writes about the troubadours, and I read some of what he or she said. H.J. Chaytor, Chaytor. And the book is old, so it's from 1912 about the troubadours. But hey, the troubadours are, 12th, 13th century phenomenon. And so old is relative, right? And in this book, Chaytor says, quote, few literatures have exerted so profound an influence upon the literary history of other peoples as the poetry of the troubadours, which is quite a statement. Few literature's profound influence, literary history. So, and it piques my curiosity just to hear that. But Chaytor goes on, attaining the highest point of technical perfection in the last half of the 12th and early years of the 13th century, Provençal poetry, troubadours of France, Provençal poetry was already popular in Italy and Spain when the Albigeois crusade devastated the south of France and scattered the troubadours abroad and forced them to seek other means of livelihood. The earliest lyric poetry of Italy is Provençal in all but language. Almost as much may be said of Portugal and Galicia. Catalonian troubadours continued to write in Provençal until the 14th century. The lyric poetry of the Trouvère in northern France was deeply influenced both in form and spirit by troubadour poetry. And traces of this influence are perceptible even in the early Middle English lyrics. Finally, the German Minnesingers knew and appreciated troubadour lyrics, and imitations or even translations of Provençal poems may be found in Heinrich von Moringen, who I've never heard of, Friedrich van Hausen, and many others. Hence, the poetry of the troubadours is a subject of first-rate importance to the student of comparative literature. Unquote. Wow, that's a lot, And it's really interesting for me to think about something as old, as far back in the centuries as troubadour poetry, as having influence in that many countries and that many different time periods. And it makes me wonder how troubadour poetry influenced our ideas of what is called personal poetry, or in the 1950s in America, confessional poetry. And it seems to me that there is a link, and that link can be mined for discovery. So I would assume that everyone in our class is interested in, quote unquote, the personal. This is so natural to us now that we forget that personal poetry was not always poetry. I think when we think of personal poetry, we think immediately of the confessionals. Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Robert Lowell. We think of Allen Ginsberg of the Beats, and maybe Kerouac, and maybe Diane DePrima, Bernadette Meyer. We think of the moderns as being anti-personal. So check them out. If you haven't read anything by Marianne Moore, for instance, read a poem called A Grave. And if you think about T.S. Eliot as a modernist poet, The Wasteland, how much do we learn about T.S. Eliot in that poem other than something that's oblique, right? Not much. Think about Wallace Stevens. Think about William Carlos Williams, who's a little more personal in my view. But if we compare the modernists, if we compare the confessional to the confessionals I would argue would be considered by us much more personal. And then think about the contemporary poets that we might know. Sharon Olds, first and foremost, in terms of how much more intimately personal can a poet get than some of the poems in The Dead and the Living or A Father. So, and then we can go on and on about the other poets. Galway Kinnell's poetry is highly personal. Jory Graham plays with the personal. Louise Glick situates the personal within a historical and mythological context. Dana Levin is a personal poet who I went to school with and who asks us to think about what personal means. So if I do think about what personal means and I think about where it came from and what it might mean to me now, I'd have to say that personal is a modern invention. You know, it's not what poets were writing in Shakespeare's time necessarily. Although Shakespeare got a lot more personal than poetry that came previous to him in English, let's say. But if we stretch even further back, we can go to the Romans. Catullus was a very personal poet. We can go to early Greek poetry. Sappho is considered personal. There are elements of what I would imagine Americans call the personal in Sappho. So by the time we get from Sappho, let's say, all the way up to the 13th century, we have this new explosion of troubadour poetry. The troubadour poetry, though, was those lyrics were highly personal lyrics, highly individualized. The authors pull themselves into the lyrics, which is probably the most important legacy to the troubadours. When we think of poetry right now, I would bet everyone in this class thinks of the elements of the personal in the class. So poetry is equated with personal effusion, with personal expression. And we forget that there were times when poems were, well, think of Homer, think of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and read them, right? Spend 20 hours reading the Iliad. And then tell me how much you know about Homer. In fact, there's debate about whether Homer wrote some of that. So how much could we possibly know about Homer, right? Or think of Dante. These are epic poems. Think of Paradise Lost. That's a very interesting case concerning what's personal and what's not. I hear a lot of Milton in Paradise Lost. I mean, Milton's personal, but it's always veiled. It's always separated by a veil between a veil of language or a veil of myth or a veil of Christian doctrine or some other tactic that he's using. And we can't then say that it's personal in the way that Linda Gregg in the United States tends to be personal. So we have this legacy, highly individualized, highly personal. We're going to look at two of the lyrics and see why that would be. Troubadour lyrics are psychologically driven. They're about the complexities of love. And the poems are not simplified, especially in relation to love. This is a very important subject in relation to the troubadours, who write endlessly about love, but they don't do it in the way that, let's say, American pop song lyrics of the 80s do. So think about, I don't know, Lionel Richie and Diana Ross's horrifying song, Endless Love, which I cringe. I just cringe the whole time. Even though I like her voice immensely, I cringe because the song is so sentimentalized, so simplistic, so straight ahead, that there's no room for any divergence from the idea of I will love you till the end of time. But even thinking about that idea, endless love, our love cannot be endless because we are not endless. We are going to die, which by definition, our love, Lionel Richie and Diana Ross characters they're playing in the song, or whatever, what's her name, Brooke Shields and whoever the blonde kid was in that film from, I don't know, 1980, those people will die too, you know? And so American culture is filled with sentimentality. How do we fight it? How do we recognize it? What do we do with it in our spirits? Because it's carried into all of us by the time we're 6, 7, 8. How do we write poetry that's more complex if we're so conditioned by Hollywood simplicity? And I'm not saying all of Hollywood, I'm just saying Hollywood, the simplified version, the version that presents love as the remedy to all. How do I come to some understanding and ability to write with complexity about this terribly, terribly complicated experience and subject that we all have some access to and experience with? Love. How do we do that? So, to me, the Troubadours are useful to read because of that. Because they are psychologically complex. And we find some of that complexity in some of the most important pop songs of the last 50 years if we really search. So I would say, and I'll just give a few ideas here, and then I want to look at the poems. Suzanne Vega's love songs are really complicated in interesting ways. The song In Liverpool, the song Gypsy, the song Rosemary, which I'm not even sure if that's a love song or not, administering or injecting a degree of the elegiac into love songs or love poems, to me automatically generates complexity. So as soon as I recognize in the language of the poem that I'm writing that love does not go on forever, love does not solve all my problems, as soon as I do that, the poems become complicated and more, I was going to say realistic, but I really dislike that word, more true to the experiences that I've had and heard about love and being with another human being. So, Suzanne Vega, Beyonce's songs about love, especially on the self-titled album, I would say, are pretty complicated and interesting. And also on Lemonade, think about those love songs. You know, the opening song, which I forget the title, Pray is in the title, I can't think right now, but it's a complicated situation. Why doesn't she just leave him, the narrator of those songs, if he is as is sort of hinted at in the songs, that he's had some kind of infidelity? Why doesn't she just leave? Simple solution. Why? Because love is complicated, and she proves it in those songs. Taylor Swift sometimes writes complicated love songs too. Mary J. Blige, A Whole Damn Year, is a fairly complicated love song. So, very unlike the simplified love songs that all too often have reached #1 on the Billboard chart, now we have endless love. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Those love songs are not very complicated, and I want to work against them. So the subject matter of troubadour poetry is love, war, spring, pastoral, so nature, dawn, but love is primary. So troubadour poetry is a European form. Southern France influenced all over Europe, as we just heard in that quote. And so there's something really there. There's a kernel in these poems in these poems slash lyrics that infiltrates many different poetic tributaries in in the European vein. So there are some 500 known troubadour poets, and of those 500, they created 1,000 forms of poetry, which is fascinating. All the poems were sung. The troubadours individually were attached to various feudal kingdoms, but they traveled widely, eking out a living for some, others being well treated by those in power for others. I'm interested in the line we can draw from them to our current time. So let's look at some troubadour poets, starting with Beatrice de Dia first. And so I'm in the troubadour link, the one that starts with Rimbaud Orange. And I'm in, you can just click on the syllabus and it says Beatrice de Dia, circa 1140 to around 1175. So she was pretty young when she died, 35 maybe. This is a fairly sophisticated form for somebody who's fairly young, but maybe the times were different. People grew up real fast. And this little tiny bit of intro to her, known only as the Contessa de Dia, the Countess of Dia. In contemporary documents, she was almost certainly named Beatrice, and probably the daughter of Count Eozar II of Dia, northeast of Mont-Limar. According to her Vita, she was married to Guillaume de Poitiers, Count of Viennois, but was in love with and sang about Rimbaud of Orange, 1146 to 1173. Her song A Chantar Mère de Soque, I can't read it in this old French, is the only canso by a troubadouriste, or female troubadour. Get that. The only one to survive with its music intact. The score is found in the Manuscript of the King, a collection of songs copied circa 1270 for Charles of Anjou, the brother of Louis XIV. So in the class I have in the module I have a link to her recording so you can listen to it. So let's look at the poem Está I en gros cosirier. I don't know what those words are. I've been in great distress of mind is her first line. Right away it's psychologically complex. Why the distress? What is the cause of the distress? How is it that this speaker is aware of her distress? And I'm assuming it's a she who is narrating the poem, which may or may not be a good idea to do very often, to equate the writer with the gender of the writer with the gender of the narrator. But it's already psychologically deep and interesting. In the first line, I've been in great distress of mind about a knight whom I possessed. The word possessed. And of course this is in translation, and so a translator made the choice of possessed. Yet still, possessed is a very that's a pretty intense word. You know, that's a word that can go in all sorts of different directions in terms of interpretation. Possessing in a positive way is not possessing in a negative way, and so on and so forth. How I've loved him to excess. I want known throughout all time. Now I feel myself betrayed, because I did not tell my love, in great torment, so I prove, in bed or in my clothes arrayed. Would that I might hold my knight, till morning naked in my arms, intoxicated by my charms, he'd think himself in paradise. For more pleased with him am I, than Floris was with Blanche Fore. I grant him my heart, my amour, my eyes, my mind, and my life. Sweet friend, so good, so gracious, when shall I have you in my power, and lie with you at midnight hour, and grant you kisses amorous? No, great desire, I nurture too, to have you in my husband's place, as soon as you grant me with grace to do all that I'd have to do. So that's quite a doozy in the last stanza when we learn that the speaker is married. And now we know almost 100% with almost 100% certainty that this is a female narrator, because it would be very unlikely to find an amorous poem about two men in terms of being committed lovers at this time in history. So we find that she's married and she's divulging this to us as readers, and her infidelity is quite it could be quite an offense to a Catholic country, right? To those in a Catholic country. We also find that the language is fairly sexualized. So I prove in bed or in my clothes arrayed. So to talk about bed, clothing, and then in the next stanza, to hold my night till morning naked in my arms, and the word naked would refer to her and him at that moment, but it would also refer us back to the bed and the clothing, so devoid of clothing. And then to say that she's intoxicated, or he is intoxicated by my charms. He'd think himself in paradise, such as Adam and Eve in paradise, and every speaker, every reader or listener, every person who is listening to this song then would have the sense of biblical reference right at their fingertips. And so it would not be a stretch whatsoever to have the word paradise relate the listener directly to Adam and Eve. And so she's doing some degree of blasphemy as well, comparing herself and him with Adam and Eve, the first two humans, according to Old Testament lore, Old Testament belief. My eyes, my mind, and my life. She's telling us about quite a bit about herself too. So woman as central subject in this poem is very interesting, and to think about how that was probably not done very often by a woman at that time, judging by the fact that there's only one extant song from a troubadour woman, is really worth paying attention to. She's giving us of self. So it's personal because of all these elements, all of them happening at once in a short period of time, 3 stanzas. And to think about what makes this personal, how much she's revealing about herself, how much she's revealing at the expense of her social order. In other words, most of her society probably would not think it appropriate or Christian or correct in any way to reveal the self in these ways, especially for a woman. And then especially when she gets to the "when shall I have you in my power," even though in the second line, remember, she says, this is about a knight whom I've possessed. So what's the difference between her having possessed him in the second line and then asking later, when shall I have you in my power? So that's kind of complex right there too. Is he or is he not in her power? What does she mean by power? Does possession of him, is she only referring to physical possession? Or is she referring to spiritual possession? Is she referring to having psychological power over him? It's a fairly deep and dense poem, and one that we could say might interest a lot of contemporary poets who are writing about personal subject matter. Especially when we get to have you in my husband's place. So she seems to want the lover instead of the husband, which cannot have been appropriate in those times. Because in ancient times, in human societies, fidelity was imposed in order to prevent the spread, and this is especially true in England, but I would assume it's true also in France, of sexually transmitted diseases, because there were no cures. And so, in order to keep the society safe and free of diseases that could never be cured, they would impose fidelity. And so I would assume that in this poem she's going against all of that, saying, I want to be with this man, and him to take his place, and for her lover to take her husband's place. So she was married to a count at the time she had an affair with Rimbaud d'Orange. Let's look at, you can look at the form of the next poem, A Chanteur Mère de ce que no volria. The form is interesting to just look at the form in and of itself, and then to move ahead, the Rimbaud d'Orange poem, and this is called Ar Resplan la Flor Inversa, and this is the very first poem of the whole collection that we're looking at. So this is her lover, right? And we hear the personal, the psychologically driven, other things in this poem as well. And this is a little bit longer, but I want to go through it anyway. Now the flowers gleam in reverse among the jagged peaks and hills. What flowers? Of snow, frost, and ice, that jagged cut and wound and sting. And dead the calls, cries, trills, and whistles among the twigs and leafless bristles. Yet joy is green, with joyous face. I see the low shriveled, and the base. For in such a way do I reverse all this, that fine plains look like hills. I take for flowers the frost and ice. In the cold I'm warm as anything, and thunderclaps are songs and whistles, and full of leaf the leafless bristles. With joy I'm firmly bound in place, seeing nothing that's low or base. Except a people born our reverse, as though nourished on the hills, who serve me worse than frost and ice. For each one with his tongue can sting, and murmurs evilly and whistles. Sticks are no good, or sharpened bristles, or threats. It's a joy to them, that race, when they can do what men call base. From kissing you, though I meet reverse, no plains prevent me, nor do hills, lady, nor do the frost and ice, but powerlessness, that's the thing. Lady, for whom I sing and whistle, your lovely gaze, like sharpened bristle, so chastens me with joy, no trace dare I own of low desire or base. I have forged onwards in reverse, searching peaks, ravines, and hills, like one tortured by frost and ice, whom the cold torments and stings, so that no more would song or whistle rule me that lawless monks the bristle. But now, praise God, joy holds a space, despite the slanderers false and base. May my verse, which I so reverse, that it's unhindered by woods or hills, go where one feels no frost or ice, nor does the cold have power to sting. To my mistress may he sing and whistle, clear, so her heart feels the sharp bristle. Who can sing nobly, with joy and grace, for it suits no singer vile and base. Sweet lady, may love, joy, and grace unite us two, despite the base. Jongleur, lest joy is in it this place, for unseen I fear lest you are base. And a jongleur is a wandering musician, which is a troubadour. And what's interesting, there are many interesting things about this poem. It feels, the form of it feels almost amorous in and of itself, in terms of the way that it winds and winds around itself with the rhymes that are running throughout. The rhymes make it very interwoven, and I love that about it. And what's also interesting is that he mentions powerlessness, but we just came from her poem, and she's like, how do I get you in my power? But he wants, or is interested in, exposing some sense of powerlessness. But powerlessness, that's the thing. Lady for whom I sing and whistle, your lovely gaze that like sharpened bristle so chastens me with joy. So he's giving himself up to joy. So maybe it's such in the troubadour poetry that we could ask at least the question, or notice that men are giving themselves over to powerlessness, men who are considered powerful, and women are asking for more power in their work, in their lives, who are often, especially in those times, but unfortunately still in ours, considered less powerful. And maybe in poetry we work out psychological dilemmas like that. Maybe that's what personal poetry is as much as anything else. He's saying powerlessness, that's the thing, and then later on, two stanzas down, nor does the cold have power to sting. So the cold is being removed in this poem. He's switching out cold for heat, and heat having to do with sexual heat for Beatrice, I assume, but also in a complex way talking about the heat that he's getting for loving a woman who's married, perhaps, and thinking about what that would do to a reputation. So I find this really, really fascinating and strangely contemporary, which I want to underscore again and again as you go forward and are writing your first poems for the class, that the kind of complexity we can bring to seduction and love matters greatly. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoy this. I'll talk to you soon.